Welcome to Helping Organizations Thrive. Today I have on the show George Minakakis. Welcome, George.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Good to see you and to speak to you today. As we enter the new year, and those who are listening onto the podcast, it might be a little bit later than January, but this is the first podcast I'm doing this year in terms of recording live. So it's great to have you on here. I'm just going to tell the audience a little bit about you, and then we'll get into some sort of conversation. You're the CEO of Inception Retail Group, which does two things. It helps companies build a longevity strategy and also a turnaround struggling businesses. Now, you're a global retail executive with over 25 years of experience in general management, business and brand development, strategy, talent development, and leadership. So a wealth of experience. And you've also published 3 books, not one book, but 3 books. And one's The New Bricks and Mortar, another one's Last Retailer Standing, and then the one we'll probably dive into a little bit more on as we talk today is The Great Transition, Emergence of the Unconventional Leadership. And what we will be exploring later on is all about authentic leadership and how that creates an impact and how we can have an influence with that and how it might differ in different cultures as well. But before we go there, I really want the audience to get to know you a little bit more in a more intimate, personal way. Is what do you love about what you do, George?
You know what? I love business. The business world is my life. I probably will tell you that from the age of 8, I can remember, this is how you make money. And so I love commerce. I love all of that. But what I love the most is being able to impact on organizations and people. I've had a great career, and I've helped a lot of people climb the ladder, the corporate ladder. And so I think they're grateful. I don't know. I haven't heard from them in a while, but I think they're grateful. And, but I'm returning a favor. I've had good mentors myself. So I love that part of the business. And I'm a retailer at heart. I grew up in it as a kid, and I found myself in it. It wasn't really the plan. I found myself in it and climbed that corporate ladder myself. But at the same time, I guess the one mantra that I have is I really want to cut out the nonsense that's people are chasing out there when it comes to retailing, and get them to the pragmatic side that helps them achieve their objectives. So that's what drives me.
Oh, there's a lot in there, and I've got about 5,000 questions I could just ask about that. The one I'm intrigued on is when you were 8 years old, you knew about in business about sort of doing things. What happened at 8 years old that made that sort of point?
Cool. Great question. So I'm the son of an immigrant of immigrant parents, right? So they came from Sparta, Greece, into Montreal. And I was born I'm a Canadian born, so I was born in Montreal. And I saw the hardship my parents went through, as immigrants, and what they had to do to adjust. And by the time I was 8 years old, I realized, you know what? If you owned a grocery store, you'd never have to worry about food. If you owned a transportation company, you'd never have to worry about transportation. And if you owned a company that builds houses, you would never have to worry about owning a house. So that was kind of the aha moment when you're 8 years old. Right. It's kind of the things that really mattered in our household, the things that my father was working for, my mother was working for, and it stuck. So then I was really involved on the consumer side, and it never gone away, ever. So I'm intrigued by it. It's driven.
That's amazing to have an aha moment at 8 years old, and to think so insightfully and so pragmatically as well. Actually, I mean, at 8 years old, interestingly, I suppose I've always been a budding entrepreneur. Me and my brother, who is slightly older than me, were washing windows in bungalows in our local area at 8 years old, going around knocking on doors and washing windows for money. And so always the entrepreneur, and it starts young.
Well, no, you're right. I was knocking. I knew where the elderly people lived in the community, so I would knock on their doors and offer to take their garbage out. And, so I would get 50 cents or $1 or whatever, take the garbage out. I mean, it was, all of us had it in us. All of it.
Absolutely. And so today I mentioned at the start, talking about authentic leadership, and it feels like a conversation that's many years old in some sense, because it's been talked about an awful lot. Authentic leadership. I think it was back in 2008 that some guy came up with the authentic leadership sort of scale in terms of defining authentic leadership and measuring it through questions and everything else, like a psychometric questions. I'd really like to get your perspective and your view on what you define, how you define authentic leadership.
Okay. So, Julian, I'll start like this. I'll start it this way. Authentic leadership has always been a subject that's been a pet peeve of mine. In fact, in the book, The Great Transition, that chapter came to life because I was trying to solve this problem that I believe it still exists. And when you look at the world around you, particularly when in my life where you do a lot of interviewing of candidates, and sometimes I'm not involved in them, but others were. And sometimes I would ask a question. So what was authentic about that individual? And you could have 3 people in the room and you'll have 3 different answers. But most of the answers were not something substantial. Well, if they were interviewing Julian is very charismatic. Julian presents well. Julian, is very appealing. Well, those are not substantial enough to determine whether or not we should hire Julian, right? But those things really got under my skin after a while and said, there's got to be a better way, because authenticity is such an important part of an individual. So the way I define it in a very simple way, first of all, in the book, I refer to it as the reliability quotient. And there's 4 attributes. It's authenticity, which is about believable leadership. It's integrity, which is about incorruptible leadership. It's credibility, about proven leadership. And then accountability, which is my favorite, no excuses leadership. But those other 3 are meaningless unless authenticity is believable. You can't convince me that you have a lot of integrity if I don't believe who you are. So, for example, let's take an individual who, if we're hiring somebody that we want them to have a good understanding about protecting the environment. Think about that. So I could have studied your company and I could have come out into the interview and said all the right things. But now you ask me a question. So, George, that's really very authentic of you. Now tell us, what have you done to actually bring that to life? Well, if I haven't not doing anything out there to drive that, to improve the environment or engage in the environment discussions, being on a podium somewhere, well, my authenticity around that falls apart pretty quickly. So I use that example because it's an important one, because authenticity is about validation, and that validation creates that believability. And if it's not there, a lot of the other things kind of fall off the sides too. That's my place in it.
I like those. I mean, we'll come on to the other aspects as well. I like those integrity, credibility, and accountability in terms of leadership as well. But just staying with the authenticity, how do we ensure that we're walking and acting in an authentic way? Because there's elements in life that we play roles, but we do play roles in different areas. We do, and we act slightly differently, don't we? Doesn't mean we're being fake. There's just a context, a situational change, isn't there? How do we ensure that we're being truly authentic? What is it about us, and how does that play out? And what, I guess, advice would you sort of share about that?
So I guess the place I've landed on that is that, authenticity to the individual is that you've reached a level of self-realization of who you are. And that makes a big difference, because that creates a higher level of trust in who you are, and that you could be counted on. And it's an important element. I've read material that suggests that a lot of people work on their authenticity, but to look real, but they never really reach that level of performance, personal performance, and awareness, and for whatever, and there are a number of reasons for it, because they don't develop themselves, or they don't have the right mentors, or they don't get the right level of experiences. All of that plays in it, but majority of us are authentic. It's just we don't get there. But Julian, let me give you this example. Think about brands, right? Luxury brands, premium brands, and mass brands. What would kind of, if you wanted to be an authentic leader, which one would you want to be? The answer is, it's not as easy as you think. But a luxury brand, from A to Z in terms of manufacturing and developing products, designing them and putting them out to market, is always flawless, or generally flawless, if it's a good brand. Premium brands do the same thing, only they serve mass markets and they start to fall apart a little bit more. Mass brands, we know, well, where did the sourcing come? Where did the products come from? So when you look at authenticity, I see it the same way. If you want to be seen as authentic, you need to try and strive for that luxury level yourself. So every aspect of who you are is not questionable.
So in some ways, the authenticity comes through this self-awareness, doesn't it? Through knowing who we are, because you can't be authentic unless you truly know who you are, your values, beliefs, what you stand for, what is your true self in that sense, isn't it? It's all about that sense of, and then I guess it's then creating that transparency, isn't it, to other people to see that through your actions, through your behaviors, your language, how you interact, and almost that's through your sort of relational stuff. So being authentic, how does that have a greater impact in leadership in an organization? Why being authentic, why being yourself or your true self makes a greater impact? Because you talked about one of your things you love about what you love is about having an impact on the people and the businesses around.
Well, so that you touched on it briefly. You talk about transparency and there's consistency in what you do as a leader. Those are important elements within the organization. So you're seen as someone that is always performing at a certain level and behaving at a certain level. Behaviors are very important, a part of authenticity. And that consistency in those behaviors is important. But if you're an individual who wants to portray themselves as someone that it has an open door, but the door is closed, or only open to a few, then authenticity starts to fall apart. I think what I'd like to add to this conversation too is that organizations also need to define what authenticity means also, right? Mm-hmm. Because the dilemma for organizations is if you don't define it, then you could end up, if you have 500 employees, you could end up with 500 different personalities in there that don't really align with where the organization needs to go. And is that
sort of values and beliefs? Do you think is that what you mean by that?
It's values and beliefs. It's style, it's behavior. It's it's just it has less to do with dress. It has more to do with how you address things, and there's a difference. And organizations need that, but they need to define it. And that's another reason why I created these 4 traits inside a reliability quotient, because I believe performance reviews are too lengthy and they don't get to the core of what an organization needs to accomplish. But ultimately, when you do this, and if you do it right as an organization, you can actually start defining what authenticity means. And if you can imagine what it'd be like if you don't. I think of your busiest street where you live, and if there's no traffic lights, right? It's the same thing. It's a nightmare, because then you've got everybody running into each other and nothing getting done. So organizations need to define what that means to them.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of the focus on authentic leadership is the individual, isn't it? In terms of how leaders should be acted, but actually organizations need to set the expectations and set out how they perceive it to be, or almost say how the brand as that organization is going to, or the culture, I should say, is going to play out in terms of the behaviors and expectations and the values that we believe, and to our clients, to our employees. And that's an interesting point, actually. It's one that's often missed, I think, in terms of people tend to just focus on the individual, don't they?
Yep. Well, and I often say, I often point out that there's I call it cost, because there is a cost to it. If you don't align the organization from a leadership point of view, your culture, your operational execution, your strategies, and your talent are never aligned. So it spells the word cost when you put those words together. And there is a cost to it when you don't align that. And
Mm.
aligning authenticity from a believable leadership point of view is the foundation for where organizations need to go.
What are your thoughts on the last, I guess, now 2 years now, when we've been going through this pandemic, in terms of styles of leadership? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about empathetic leadership, which sort of links in a little bit with authentic leadership. Do you think those organizations that have continued to thrive and are successful are playing more into an authentic approach, and those who are not playing that way? Do you think there's a difference? Have you noticed that with the organizations you deal with?
Absolutely. So look, when the news comes out that a retailer has shut down their stores because in New York City, the virus is spreading too fast. They want to protect their customers and their employees. That's empathy, right? An organization has a high standard, and that permeates with the public. And on the other hand, you have somebody who fires 900 people
Yes, on Zoom.
So that's, there's no empathy there, right? I mean, that's absolutely, it's a very important aspect of what's happened with the pandemic is that people begin to matter again, right? It's not just the numbers. Numbers do matter because you have no organization to run if you're not delivering. But when you have a high standard in terms of empathy and managing people managing your employees and leading them, they will manage and lead with your customers. The one feeds the other.
Mm.
Then organizations thrive, and you can see that in many of them. But the pandemic has certainly pushed that envelope. Some organizations closed down over the holidays, gave some employees 10 days off or 8 days off, whatever it was. That's a big deal. You're making a statement, and more people will want to work for you. More people will trust you. This is important. Now, I did say something to somebody else the other day, which was the organizations that continue to follow up with this post-pandemic and we are able to embed this into their culture and develop it further are the ones that are probably going to grow the fastest over the next few years.
And just with those examples you've cited, it almost is like not rocket science that you should adopt a more empathetic, authentic leadership. However, there's a lot of companies out there that are not and are still successful. Why do you think they're not pursuing a more, I suppose, more human-centric approach, I guess, to leadership?
Well, a lot of those organizations are in live day to day. You can be successful, but you're living day to day, and it's about short-term results, and that matters more than anything else. And that's the culture, right? They've bred that culture, and I'd be interested to see what the turnover numbers are in organizations like that too. I don't think people join organizations like that for a long time. I think they join organizations because they need a job, and eventually they move on. But it's cultural. Different countries have different views of how you manage and lead people and how you treat them.
And how does, just as we talked about, organizations have different ways of playing out authenticity according to their values, I guess. Have you noticed differences in different cultures around the world in terms of how that's played out? Because obviously, me talking to somebody in India versus talking to somebody in Canada might have a different perspective on what authentic leadership is.
Well, you're right. So I will tell you that I may not come across as your typical Canadian. I've been told that many times because I spent a lot of time in the U.S. and no harm, no insults to my U.S. friends, but it's beneficial. But culturally, Canadians, we tend to be very reserved. You don't hear us being the cheerleaders in the back. We certainly got a lot of spirit and fight in us, but we're not usually the ones that are doing it. My Australian friends will tell you culturally, we're very upfront. We can be standoffish as well, which is true. But you think about how that affects. And you mentioned India. I read something in India. When it comes to authenticity, it's more about rising to a higher level of personal consciousness. So that's very unique. I've never thought of that. but I think it comes back to that self-realization in some way. But it's a cultural thing. It's different. And so we do have differences that way. But I always say, if you if you relocate somebody who's an introvert from Canada to the U.S., quite capable, has all the, you're smiling because you know what I'm about to say, and you send them out there for an interview and they don't get the job, but they're quite capable. They have all the credentials, they have all the experience behind them, but because they're an introvert, right? In the U.S. culture, they may not be seen as someone who's capable of leading, right? That's part of the dilemma that takes place with different cultures. That they're just locked into their blinders, and they see what they think their world should be like, and anybody coming in should be the same. Unfortunately, you shortchange your organization from diversity and growing when you do that, and it is problematic.
So I guess we're saying that we're, in some sense, a product of our culture that we live in, aren't we? In terms of, I live in the UK, and we're a little bit more reserved probably than Canadians. I know we are. My daughter's in Canada. She's in BC, and they're a bit less reserved than we, I think, and even less than the US, obviously. Do you think also, just diving down to that authenticity piece of, is it deeper than just our values and beliefs? Does it go really down to our core of who we are? Because obviously we're trying to bring that true self out here, aren't we? Because so people know, who George really is, who Julian really is, and there's ways of bringing that out. It goes deep in just the cultural thing, isn't it? And we are influenced by the culture. I appreciate that, but do you think it's really much deeper than that?
Julian, I brought my kids up, and my middle child once asked me when he was about 7 years old, because I was going off to work, is, Daddy, when will I be a leader like you? I had no real good answer at that moment, but one came to me because my wife says I always have to answer the question the kids asked. So I answered, and I said, well, when your heart, mind, and soul are one, then you'll know you're a leader, right? And it stuck with them. And I've shared that with adults many, many times because it's true, right? When you finally connected with yourself, that's the beginning. It's the beginning of the foundation of who you become.
Yeah, that's important. Actually, it's that. Was it the two important dates in your life: the day you were born and the day you find out why, which goes back to that sort of purpose, self-awareness. And once you know that, and you start acting yourself and who you are, then you start doing things to a level of excellence, because that's what you're here to do. If you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Excellent. Just moving on to, you had three other aspects to your was it something relate? Was it relate? What was the quote? Leadership quotient? What was the?
Yeah, so it's called the Reliability Quotient, and so I tied the four together. So authenticity, I tied it to integrity, which is about incorruptible leadership, and basically that means, well, incorruptible is quite upfront. You're not going to say or do anything that will harm your reputation or the reputation of the organization or anyone else, right? You're not going to take a bribe. You're not going to fire 900 people. It's about that. And then credibility, I defined it as proven leadership, that we can look back to Julian and George and what they've done in their past, and that validates their ability to deliver results. And then accountability, and says, so you are, you hold yourself accountable, but you also hold everyone else accountable to the same standards. So there's consistency in what you're doing. But like I said before, these three, integrity, credibility, and accountability, mean nothing without authenticity, right? All of these three deliver to making you believable, and that's fundamentally what this was all about. And if an organization wanted to create their own reliability quotient, they would be far better off as an organization long term, because it's just 4 attributes to work off of, as opposed to 30 or 40 in a performance review, which has always baffled me anyway. So
Yes, I've always been baffled with 10 pages of doing a performance review. It feels like too much excessiveness about it all. Yes, I agree.
And nobody's
Um,
trained to be to write behavioral reviews.
well, no, and it's interesting. You talk about those four aspects. Authenticity, integrity, credibility, and accountability. Even those in themselves, how do you measure those? How do you sort of determine whether somebody's being more authentic or not? What are the, I guess, statements you would use? Because even then, credibility is a little bit more robust in the sense of you can see somebody's done something. Integrity, again, how do you measure that? Accountability is a little bit more easier. That'd be interesting to bring to pass, actually.
Well, you're right. It is, and I have defined it in the book. I gave examples of what integrity is about. Um, but integrity is also about empathy.
Mm.
Is your empathy, does your empathy have integral background to it?
Mm.
So there are a lot of people who are great actors, by the way. And a lot of
Yes.
people who are great actors.
There is.
And so you have to be able to define that. And organizations can take those four traits or competencies and build around them what they
Yeah.
want them. I defined them the way I thought they should be, but you can add more to it. And each one only has 10 points to it.
Right.
What to do is just check them off or even change them. But the idea behind it is, simplify this, simplify it, because you're going to make your organization far more effective by sticking
Mm.
to principles that actually are easily accepted by everyone. Because you know what, um, if you say integrity is important, people will start working on their integrity, and they'll
Mm.
recognize what they can and can't do. And
Yeah.
if you say credibility is about proven leadership, think about it. If you want to work for Apple and one of their traits is about credibility and is proven leadership, you're going to work hard at proving your leadership, right? And that means everything that you do day in and day out. I really believe in these traits they're important in getting organizations to create that reliability and performance. And
Mm.
today, Julian, in this marketplace, it's fast changing. You don't know what's coming next. Technology is continuously
Mm.
disrupting everything. Reliability becomes that much more important.
Oh, totally. And it's interesting because I work with companies and I do a lot of value, sort of help them work on their values as organizations. And I always then one of the ways to embed values into an organization is to put them into the yearly sort of performance review. It's almost list your values and are they living up to those values as behaviors, and it keeps that focus on integrity is one of them, and obviously give examples of how they've been had integrity in that year. So it's a way of embedding and focusing and bringing to life, I guess, something that's just put on a piece of paper.
Hmm.
We live these values because we're gonna track you on them. Some of them are a little bit subjective because sometimes it's not always difficult to define stuff, but at least have an intent of that focus. I like the last one you said about the accountability. So I think to me, any leadership has to have an accountability about it, and whether that's in a government leadership through to leading a company and through to our own self. Accountability is key because without accountability nothing really happens, does it? Because people at this time of year are setting their new year's, whether it's resolutions or goals, and they're great, and it's good to have a focus, it's good to have something to go for. But if you've not got an accountability with somebody, whether that's a friend, a coach, or a colleague, without enough motivation, that's probably not going to happen because you're just, well, it doesn't matter. So having that accountability is quite key, isn't it, in terms of making leadership really happen?
Well, it is. And how do how do you grow if there's no accountability? How do individuals grow? How do how the performance of the organization grow? One of the accountability. I worked for PepsiCo for several years, and during the time that I worked for them, and I'm not sure if they still do it anymore, but mid-year there was always a developmental review. It was not a performance review; it was a developmental review. And I always looked at it as a form of accountability by the organization to ensure that they were developing their people. And it was always driven that way. So accountability has different measures, but I'm just throwing that out as an example that it's not always financial.
No.
Sometimes it's just something that you want to do to improve the organization by.
And
by the way, I felt that it's probably those best 7 years. Not that the other companies I worked for weren't great, but from a developmental point of view, that was probably the best 7 years of my life.
Interesting. Well, it's been great talking to you and just opening up a bit more about authenticity and how that plays out in leadership. I think others will have different views, different perspectives, which is good and good to have. But I think it's a really valid thing to talk about, and it's an important aspect of leadership, however you sort of define it, having that sense of being more human-centric, more about being ourselves, I think is really sort of vital now in organizations. If people are interested in your book, what remind them what it is, and perhaps show them the picture of it if you've got it in front of you.
Well, I've got my working copy here. I don't know if I can do this. There we go. Actually, it's in the background with me as well. The book's available just about every bookstore around the world, but today, I think some 60% of books are sold through Amazon, so it's there as well. If that makes it's more expeditious. So it's a great book. I enjoyed writing it because I wrote it because it was about the transition that a lot of organizations and leaders are facing, going from the 20th century to the 21st century, and we're only into the second decade of this, and long way to go. But if anybody wants to get a hold of me, it's through inceptionretailgroup.com, and there's an email address there, and you can get in touch with me.
Well, thank you for your time today, George. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Pleasure, Julian. Thank you.